Hello, everyone. This is Chris Connolly with the HarperCollins Library Marketing Team, joined by Lainey Mays for a new episode of Door to Door. And we are thrilled today to welcome two fantastic authors to our company. We're welcoming Vendela Vida, author of We Run the Tides, and Ellie Eaton, author of The Divines. So thank you both so much for joining us today. How this is going to work, we're going to have Vendela talk about her new novel, and we're going to be putting Ellie in the green room, as we like to say, and Ellie's already familiar with our virtual sushi and virtual snacks there. But this is a very special episode, and this isn't necessarily how we planned it, but we're dealing with two very special novels that deal with growing up, female friendships, adolescence, and also involving all female schools. So there's some connective tissue there, but they're also both so beautiful and unique. Lainey, I don't know if you want to introduce Vendela and We Run the Tides first before we start.
Sure. Well, I guess first of all, how are you guys? You want to tell them where you're coming from before we go into our intros? Yeah. Want to start?
Let's go.
Okay.
I'm in LA.
It's exciting. And how are you both? I know we were just talking before we got on about like how the world is, and we're glad to sit down and talk about books.
My lovely agent has this phrase, which is like cautiously optimistic. She used that kind of a lot, you know, when your book goes out into the world and you just sit there biting it. So there was a lot of like cautious optimism. And I in fact made her a t-shirt with that. So I feel like I am the embodiment now of like cautious optimism, maybe.
Yeah, I'm just trying to do a lot of math with my kids about like colleges, doing a lot of math. I don't even care if I do the math homework. Like, this is more important. So that's what's going on here.
Yeah, I like took out a calculator last night and I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. These numbers, like leave it to them. I don't know why I'm doing this. Okay, so first we want to talk about We Run the Tides. Vendela Vida, we're so excited to have you on. And this book is just so amazing, and it was such a great one for me to read, and I didn't want it to end. So I'm trying to get back to my screen. Here you go. So Vendela Vida is award-winning author of 6 books, including Let the Northern Lights Erase Your Name and The Diver's Clothes Lie Empty, founding editor of The Believer magazine and co-editor of The Believer Book of Writers Talking to Writers and Confidence, or The Appearance of Confidence. And this book, We Run the Tides, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and I'll let you explain because you're going to do it so much better than me. But I just, it's, you know, pre-tech boom 80s San Francisco, and there's so much to dive into. But I think just like, as far as exploring female friendships and like growing up, and like you did such an amazing job talking about just the intricacies of being a female and going through awkward stages, but also like with the power you yield. So thank you for writing this book. And I don't know if we want to go tell us a little bit about it.
Sure.
Well, first, I'm sorry to interrupt. I do want to introduce Ellie first, and then what we're going to do, we'll put Ellie in the green room and then go from there. So Ellie, thank you also for joining us. And this is your debut, The Divines, coming in January. It's been compared to Normal People and The Girls, and it's a literary debut set in England at a secluded boarding school for young women, and follows particularly one woman, Josephine, who years later is reckoning with some memories that are coming out that she had long suppressed. She's living in present-day Los Angeles, in fact. And as far as your bio goes, you're a freelance writer whose work has appeared in The Guardian, The Observer, and Time Out. You're a former writer in residence at a men's prison in the UK, which is fascinating. And you hold an MA in creative writing from Royal Holloway, University of London, and you're a recipient of a Kerouac Fellowship. And you were born and raised in England, and now you live in LA with your family. And this is your first novel that Sarah Perry calls a terrific and entertaining and astute work. So big words indeed. Can't wait to hear about it. But again, we're going to put you in the green room, and we'll see you again soon, okay?
Thank you. See you later.
See you.
Okay, so Vendela, tell us about We Run the Tides.
Okay, I will. I also want to say thank you so much for taking the time to be here today and talk about literature, which is a great distraction on a surreal day. And it's also really nice to be doing this conversation, not at the same time, but with Ellie. And we've been in touch before the event. So I'm just grateful that you're here. And thank you, Lainey and Chris. And I'm going to share with you a little bit today about what it was like to grow up in San Francisco in the 80s, because that's where my new book, We Run the Tides, takes place. And I thought I'd start by asking you a question. I'm wondering how many of you have arrived at a party when it's already over. I feel like if you're like me, there've been many parties like that. And that's actually what it was like to grow up in San Francisco in the 80s. I felt like, it was like arriving at a party where the music is over. There's some people have either left or they're incoherent. There's no food except for a bowl of pretzels that's like smashed or has like soggy, they're soggy from beer, that sort of thing. That's what it was like growing up in San Francisco in the 80s, because you had the sense that everything fun had happened before you got there. And this novel is not autobiographical at all, but it does draw on my experience of growing up there and a lot of the memories and the sensibility of growing up in that time period. I live in San Francisco still, again, I should say. I left for many years and came back. And so I really wanted to explore San Francisco as a metaphor too for all the changes that have happened over the years. But as a teenager, which is when this novel is set in the 80s, when I was a teenager and the characters are teenagers, I was constantly hearing these stories about all the exciting and revolutionary things that had happened before I was born. The Haight-Ashbury had all, obviously had the Summer of Love, all the beat poets had hung out in North Beach, and everything interesting had happened before in the past. And if there's any excitement left to be found, my friends and I realized we had to either find it or create it ourselves. So in We Run the Tides, there are two protagonists, Eulaby and Maria Fabiola. That's her magnetic best friend. Eulaby is the narrator, and they, like all teenagers, believe they kind of own the streets of their neighborhood. They live in San Francisco in a foggy neighborhood called Seacliff, which is by the ocean. And they attend a upscale all-girls school. They know this neighborhood very well because they spend all their afternoons walking it, and that's where they see the boys on their skateboards. That's where they know all the eccentric characters. They spend a lot of time at the beach. One day on their way to school, Maria Fabiola and Eulaby witness something. They witness a horrible act, or do they? That's the big question of the book, and the question that actually creates a rupture in their friendship, because Eulaby thinks they have witnessed a horrible act. Maria Fabiola disagrees that it was, and the rupture between the two girls is followed by Maria Fabiola's disappearance, which is considered a potential kidnapping, and it shakes the quiet community and threatens to expose all sorts of unspoken truths that have been existing for years in their neighborhood. I've long been fascinated by teenagers. I've been one. I've taught them, and now I'm raising them. And I'm intrigued by the drama of girlhood and the potentially shattering force of early teenage friendships. I think the enormous part of being a young teenage girl is coming into a new power and watching as you wield this power and seeing how much you can get away with. And I think this is especially the case when rigid rules are in place, the rigid rules and boundaries like they are in the all-girls school environment that I write about in We Run the Tides. So I'm really excited to share this book with you. I feel really grateful that writers like Mary Beth Keane and Nick Hornby and Neg Wolitzer have called the book funny, because that was my intention when I wrote this book, to write a funny book. So it'd be really terrible if no one thought it was funny. So I'm really grateful to them. I'm really grateful to you. Thank you so much for sharing it with your readers. Thank you in advance. I hope that it really brings them some laughter and transports them back to their own teenage years and helps them reflect on their childhood friendships and how they help form the people they became.
So wonderful. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I had this quote to share too, the Mary Beth Keane quote, which she said, "This is one of the best novels about girlhood and female friendship I've ever read." And then, like you said, the quotes just keep going. I mean, we'd be here all day if I sat here and read them, like Nick Hornby, Tom Stoppard. I didn't want it to end. And I totally agree. And I think you did such a wonderful job, like I had said before, about just capturing like what it is to be a girl and growing up. And so when you were saying that about like what power you yield, I thought that was a very interesting way to think about, growing up. And so did you always, because I know you in this great behind the book, which everybody can read on Edelweiss, you talked about like starting writing these stories when you were younger about female friendship and exploring that. So when you started this one, did you imagine it to always be 4 friends, or was it going to be 2 girls, or how did that evolve?
How did I start it? You know, it actually started, it's funny, this book actually started another incarnation 4 years ago on the day after Election Day. And it started as a nonfiction book about lying. And so here we are, it's exactly 4 years ago. And I became really obsessed for political reasons with lying. And I became really interested in the words of Cicely Bach, this philosopher who's written many books about lying, and how she talks about how lies just can kind of contaminate a society. They can start at the top, or they can start at the bottom, but they contaminate a society. So that was my nonfiction book that I worked on for about a year. And eventually it morphed into this book, which is also a book about lying, but it's about 4 girls and their relationship. How did it start with the 4 girls? I think I wanted to make it not as insular as 2 girls. I wanted to start with a community of 4. And I just see my own daughter with her friend group and how important these friend groups are, and the dynamics are always shifting, and who's the best friend with who. And it felt more real to me that they would be in a friend group than just 2 people. But the whole book does focus primarily on the 2 main characters, Eulalie, the narrator, and Maria Fabiola, her fabulous best friend.
Yeah. And then, I mean, did you have some kind of music that you'd always go back to? Because there's such great 80s references and music in there, but I just need a Spotify playlist, I feel.
That's really funny. You know, music is very important to me in all, you know, I edited a book of interviews with musicians. I don't listen to music when I'm writing, but there were 2 soundtracks actually that were pretty important to me. One was the sound of, a friend of mine sent me a link to the sound of skateboards in San Francisco in the 80s. And just hearing the sound, which is a very different sound. Obviously there's skateboarders now in the city, but the pavement is smoother, the wheel, there might be electric skateboards, everything's just a little less gritty than it was. And just hearing the sound captured of the wheels on the road actually just brought back, it was like a Proustian moment. I just brought back a flood of memories. And, you know, thinking about going to the Esprit outlet when we're, you know, even the book's cover was kind of inspired by Esprit clothing colors of the 80s. So the Esprit outlet was in Potrero Hill in the city at the time. And so that was one thing, that was one sound that really brought back a lot of things for me. And the other sound was actually, I was trying to think what band the girls in the book would be obsessed with. And I didn't want it to be, my friends and I were obsessed with the Police, but I didn't really, and Duran Duran, but I didn't really want to write about that so much. But I was thinking another band that was really popular was the Psychedelic Furs. And so they kind of take on this obsession with the Psychedelic Furs. And there's a scene where Eulalie goes to a concert, a Psychedelic Furs concert. The problem was I had never been to a Psychedelic Furs concert. So in the past couple of years, I've been to 2. And I went with a friend 2 years ago, and we were actually in the back row, close to the back row. And I was thinking, okay, this is when this would happen in the book. And we really went there as a researcher. And I was thinking, oh, I can really see how my character would be interested in this music. And I felt a tapping on my shoulder. It was kind of hard. And I thought maybe I was mistaken. And I felt like and my friends got tapped on her shoulder, and she was like, ow, and we turned around, and there was a man tapping us with a cane, telling us to sit down, and really, you know, really aggressively. And I thought, we're not in the 80s anymore. So that was the research I did for the book. But yeah, I'm glad you picked up on the music. It was, you know, I think everyone has the soundtrack to their lives. And if I'd been smart, I would have put together a Spotify list of all the 80s music, and I would be someone who wrote to music. Maybe next book.
I have Love My Way ready to play on Spotify when this is over, because that song's so good. But and Maureen Roberts, a librarian friend of ours, asked, did you go to an all-girls school, and how is that setting specifically important to the story?
Mm-hmm. I did go to an all-girls school, and the book, like I said, the book is not autobiographical, but I think you always, I've never written about San Francisco really, and I usually set my books in other countries, like I've set books in Turkey or the northern part of Scandinavia, but I've never set a book in the city in which I was raised. And I'm really just interested in how you have all these girl dynamics in all-girls school, and you really don't, boys become even more of an other because you don't have them at school. And there's also the sense that when you go to an all-girls school, usually your friends have, I don't know if Ellie had this experience, I'll be curious to know, but most of my friends only had sisters, because usually when your parents picking out of school, you want a school that all your kids can go to. So we really never saw boys. So when we saw them, it was just like, it was a really, the boys kind of took over our lives in a way that I think was not the intention of setting up an all-girls school. I call the school in the book Sprag, because I became really obsessed with Edith Wharton when I was writing this book, and in particular, The Custom of the Country, which I just think is a great satire of social manners. And I think that heroine of Custom of the Country is one of my favorite heroines or anti-heroines of all time. And so I named the school Spragg after Undine Spragg, because I just thought it was kind of funny that everyone's kind of emulating her in some way. Thanks for the question.
And I'm just curious because we talk about lies amongst and the power of lies and what they do, and there's so many sections of this book that do that, but also just experiences these young women have that they just don't talk about, that maybe they should have spoken about. I mean, could you talk about how you navigate writing about lies and like what's told, what's not, especially when you're looking back?
Well, it's funny because I think that there is something about that age too, where these events happen and you don't necessarily process them. So I made a couple choices in the book where some pretty egregious things might have happened to some of the girls, but they don't talk about it, because especially then it wasn't this therapy culture where you would express yourself about and compare notes on things in the same way. It was really, everyone's kind of secretive toward each other as well, because they're trying to put on this facade of everything's fine. So that was my impression when I really thought about lying in the 80s versus lying now. I think it was very different in some ways. And I think, I do think, I'm not even condemning lying. I think as a teenage girl, it's part of it, right? You're trying on different hats. Sometimes literally, like in this book, they're trying on different hats. And I think that I really want to I think that part of my goal in writing this book was talking about how it's fine to do it at a certain point, but if you keep lying beyond that time when you know you shouldn't, then that's a problem. And so one of the characters in the book can't stay in reality. Her tether to reality starts to really disappear, basically. She has no tether to reality. And so I wanted to play with that a little bit.
I feel like it would be a very different story in modern day with social media. If you're lying, they know.
Totally, but it was funny because my daughter read the book and she had some astute comments. She's 15, and she said, it's so funny because in the book, Eulaby gets ostracized from her friends, and she was like, well, that's kind of like in social media when you get canceled or something. There are all these analogies. The cruelty of teenage girls doesn't change. The ways that they are cruel can be are swifter and faster and more public now, but they're always me testing how much they can get away with.
Exactly. Or what your narrative maybe is. That's what I really enjoyed about the book, of thinking of like what your personal narrative is and what you tell to people, and how it's just so different than, and somebody else's word against yours can be, we were talking about cancel culture, and that made me think of it. So Lillian Dabney she wanted to know, so you said you left San Francisco and came back. What was it like coming back after so many years, and how did that go into the book?
What was it like to come back? I lived in New York for many years, and I lived abroad and then came back, and it was very strange to see how much things have changed, especially even the places I talked about, especially North Beach, this area that I really love, because any pretentious young teenager in San Francisco would go there and, sip cappuccinos, even though I didn't even like coffee, just so I could feel, as part of the literary scene as a 16-year-old. But going back there, just seeing how much that had changed even. And, there was a restaurant called Naked Lunch, obviously after the book, and no one at the restaurant even knew why it was called it that. They just assumed it was kind of fun to have naked lunch. And I found it really, it was really hard at first to kind of navigate the differences. And this was even before, I came back even before the tech boom started, but slowly seeing that happen was also very, very difficult, and it sometimes made me want to move out and move away again. So that's what it's like coming back to San Francisco. It's like seeing someone that you really love not doing so well. That's what it's like.
And I just have to say, so having now read the book, We Run the Tides is a perfect title. And particularly I think about, one of the opening scenes is Eulaby and Maria, and they know how to time the tides on the beach. That's like something only they know how to do. And there's like this really like powerful sense of agency, and just, it's like that youthful belief in yourself that you kind of run the tides. Can you talk about, as a writer, what it was like entering that space and like trying to inhabit that?
Trying to inhabit the space of that, Well, I spent a lot of time going to the beaches in San Francisco and even counting the steps or thinking about things like that. The title, I'm glad you brought up the title, because I think titles are kind of the hardest part for writers to come up with. And I did have a title for a while. This book was called Raft with Medusa. And that was a title I tried to use for my very, very first novel. And the publisher at the time, Snoff, talked me out of it. And then with this book, I sent in the manuscript with the title Raft with Medusa. No comment, no comment from my agent or my editor. And slowly I realized that was a title that would need to go. So I came up with a lot of other titles and none of them were quite working. And then again, my daughter read it and she came up with the title. And as soon as she said it, I just felt like it was exactly what I was going for with the book. These girls who think they have the power, they're literally running the tides, but they also are they're running the tides of their own narrative and their friendships. And so that ended up being the title pretty quickly.
Kudos to your daughter. She knows what's up. Is she a writer as well?
She is, yeah.
Excellent. Let's see. Jennifer Wimberry, another friend of ours, librarian friend, says girls particularly, but children were freer in the 80s, weren't they? And you can say if you agree or disagree. How did that freedom influence and inform the choices that girls made at that time?
You know, I totally agree. Thank you for your question. We had a lot of, when I was looking back at my own experiences, we had a lot of freedom. You know, we really were out. I was trying to explain this to my kids the other day. We were out from after school until maybe 7 or 8 o'clock. And there, you know, we didn't have cell phones or anyway. Our parents just knew we'd come back in the evening. And I think that I really appreciate that freedom in a way. It is, you know, we did get into a considerable amount of trouble sometimes, but I think that's just, it's all part of trying to figure out who you are. But that was also something I really had to look back at when I was writing the book and think about how much freedom we actually had. And some of the things that happen in the book now, I don't think kids today would actually have the freedom to do that for a variety of reasons, most of them involving technology.
So can we talk about Yulby's dad's antique art gallery? I thought that was such a cool space because not only is it a formulation of like all of these old things coming together and becoming new again, but he's in the middle of the part of town that is, you know, when they filmed the movie, they're saying like, we want it to look like we're near ritzier things that it's not. So why this antique gallery and what does it do for her upbringing?
So I'm glad you brought that up. So to clarify, there's a scene, Yulby's father has an antique gallery and it's kind of on the wrong side of the tracks, which is now kind of the right side of the tracks in San Francisco, but at the time it was kind of a dangerous area, and I put it there exactly for that reason, because I wanted the book to be very much about this transformation of a city as well. And so here he is having a gallery selling things from the past, and everything else in the city is moving forward and moving toward the tech boom. And so it was very much, you know, a metaphor for everything. But yes, when they filmed the TV show at his gallery, they try to pretend that it's more of an upscale part of town because that's what suits it. I had a lot of fun writing kind of the meta version of how the gallery is portrayed in the film, in the TV show that's where it's shot, and then versus what it was actually like. Thank you for that question.
Excellent. All right, let's see here. I'm just gonna check Facebook. And this is a good question. So Lillian asks, how did you decide about the point of view? Was that something you kind of had in your head from the get-go?
Thank you so much for asking that. You know, I've written books and point of view is really important to me, and I really experiment with different points of view. And so my last book, The Divers Clothes Lie Empty, was told all in the second person. And that started because it was about identity, and I wanted the you in the book and Divers Clothes to be anybody. You know, she could be you, literally, the character. With this book, I started writing it in the first person plural. We do this, we do that, we run these streets of Seacliff, they're ours. And because I think there is that sense when you are growing up as a teenage girl, you really identify as a pack of 4 or 6 or however many people are in your friend group. And then slowly in the narrative, especially after the rupture between the friends involving what they saw or didn't see that day at school, the narrative slips into I and it becomes Yulby's story. But I think about point of view a lot, and I'm glad you asked. Thank you.
Someone's at the door. And again, everyone here just is either very excited or they have read and loved the book, and they so appreciate you being on. again, I have to say this is a fantastic, and it is funny, and it's just kind of an enveloping read. You really do get lost in the time period and these relationships. I don't know if there's anything else you would like to say before you go, Vendela. Again, we just so appreciate you being on. It's been great to hear it from you here about this fantastic book.
I appreciate being on too. Thank you so much for having me, and I hope you all enjoy it, and I hope that your readers and enjoy it as well. Thank you so much. I can't wait to listen to what Ellie has to say.
Excellent. Thanks, Vendela. So we run the Tides. It goes on sale February 9th. So for you librarians watching, get your library reads votes in by January 1st, and the eGalley is available. I can't recommend it enough. I know there's a lot going on out there. And as always, reading can be a safe, but also challenging and just enlightening space to, weather the storm, you could say. So again, Vendela, thank you so much. All right, so now we're going to bring Ellie back on. And again, thank you so much, Vendela, for joining us today. All right, here we go. That book is fantastic.
It really was.
That title is perfect. So
yeah, captures.
Hi, Ellie.
Hi.
Welcome back.
Turning off one bit of technology.
So the green room, did it live up to your expectations?
It was very relaxing. Thank you.
The sushi was to taste, I hope.
Yeah, I mean, no complaints. No, that was so, I was listening to Vendela, and it was so interesting because I think there's so much crossover in our work. So everything she was saying, I was like, yes, oh yes, like that. Mm-hmm. Also that. Yeah, it was really good.
Oh, well, we can't wait to explore it. So we gave a very brief overview when we started the episode, but Ellie, would you mind kind of giving a bit more detail about your book?
Sure. I thought maybe I'll tell you what it's about, but then also sort of maybe how I came to write the book, maybe. So loosely, my book, I think, as you mentioned, moves between contemporary LA and then Britain in the 90s. And it's really about a woman who becomes incredibly obsessed by her past. So 15 years after her elite English boarding school has shut its doors in, really a disgraceful way, Josephine, my narrator, she makes this really rash decision on her honeymoon to visit her former campus. And what happens is that it kind of brings back all of these memories of her friendships when she was there. And in particular, this sort of moment or act of like extreme violence that had kind of blown up her teenage world. So I think when I describe it, I kind of typically say, oh, it's like, it's like a coming of age novel about teenagers and teenage sexuality and sisterhood. But there's a lot in the book that is about the dangers of privilege and the kind of very weird, toxic nature of the class divide in Britain. So that's my kind of back blurb. But how I came to write it was that a few summers ago, I was back in England, as it typically go back once a year. And I was driving in the car with my husband, and we were quite near the town where I'd gone to school. When I left school, I just had no interest in reunions. I mean, I left and I really just completely lost contact with almost everyone I was at school with. And I just had this like sudden desire. I was like, well, let's just see what's there. And what I discovered was that there was basically nothing there. All of my boarding schools, boarding houses and classrooms had been kind of turned into these apartment blocks, and the really ugly modern gym had been like flattened, and the grass tennis courts had been concreted over. I think it was basically gone, apart from the school chapel. And my much to my husband's like acute embarrassment, I sort of finagled my way past the receptionist of what had become like this dental surgery inside the chapel. It was very, very strange. I know. I guess because it was a listed building, they couldn't knock it down or change it, so it had to remain pretty much as it was. So I kind of managed to persuade her to let me sit in the space where the altar would have stood, which was now this really surreal waiting room. And that thing that happens if you smell something and you're suddenly back in a moment. So that happened, but it was as if like nothing had changed, because the organ was sort of right up the back of the chapel, was still there. The choir stalls were there. Like it was the same revolting salmon-coloured pink. It was, I mean, it was so strange. And I think in that moment, it was like all of those memories of being a teenager kind of came flooding back. So I guess that was like, and the idea of writing, you know, using a boarding school environment as the setting of a book about the teenage experience seemed kind of interesting to me, because, you know, these girls lived in this really tight, claustrophobic environment. You know, and in and amongst that, there are the experimentations with like sex and drugs that are going on. Yeah, and I think I just remember sitting in this pew and remembering like how embarrassing the teenage body was. You know, you'd feel so out of control. And, you know, that kind of strange power, I think, that the friendships we make at that age have over us. You know, they seem to sort of eclipse absolutely everything else. You know, parents, teachers, everything's got, like, everything is about your friends at that age. So that was kind of like the first piece of the jigsaw when I was thinking about this book. And then I think sort of either on that trip or a trip the year after, I was chatting to my sister and I was saying, well, you know, I kind of want to write this book about being a teenager, loosely based on the school that we'd gone to. And she told me that someone that she had gone to school with had recently written to her and written this incredibly like heartfelt apology for how she treated my sister when we were at school together. So my sister was 2 years above me at school. So, you know, in a way that was this really lovely act, but the weird thing was my sister had like no memory at all of being bullied, like none, or like singled out by this woman. So I just found that completely mesmerizing. I became a bit obsessed. I was like, well, how could my sister have forgotten that? That seemed crazy to me. Like, how would you forget that dynamic? And then, you know, if she, in that case, like whose was right, like the woman or my sister? So that idea really like got its hooks into me. And I sort of then began to play around the idea about how reliable any of us might be as the narrators of our own story. Like, I think we're probably pretty flawed. So it was those like two things that seemed to mesh together, and that's when I really started getting into the book.
And speaking of your personal experience, you sent along this photo, which I'm going to share now, if that's okay.
My mum sent it to me yesterday, and I was like, "Oh yeah, I remember."
Here we are. And I think also it's interesting. I you know, the blurred faces and everything. I know that's just for like security purposes, but it also just speaks. The photo, the mood of the photo, I think, is so perfect. Whether it's like, this, I don't know.
Do you know what's really funny about that photo? And I was I only remembered this yesterday when my mum sent it to me, was that this is actually a staged photograph that they took for the school prospectus. So they created this vision of what the school should look like on an idyllic day. So they have like people, you know, chasing each other in the background. And look, I don't know, it's ridiculous, probably holding books, I don't know, somewhere. But I was like, oh, that's so interesting. This is just like this kind of completely fraudulent snapshot. And then like, if you like unpeel that, was like a very different story.
What would be happening if this was a?
There would be like smoke plumes coming from out of the bushes. Right? It's like, yeah, you know, giants.
Gosh, yeah, and I love that kind of thinking about like a veneer of a place versus the reality of it. And I love that you talked, because like you said, this book deals not only with like a girls' boarding school and, you know, all the coming of age exploits and secrets and complexities that go along with that, but it's also the class divide. So can you talk about exploring that and like, you know, how you kind of married those two? Because I think it's perfect how those two play.
When I started writing the book, I'd been living in America, I guess about 5 years. And I think the longer that we were out of the country, the weirder the class system was. I mean, you know, I guess you don't notice it. It's a bit like the frog in the pot. You don't really notice it when you're in it. And then, you know, suddenly I'd come back and, you know, it just seemed kind of preposterous. Like, and I think, you know, public school alumni, you know, I think people like Boris Johnson, for example, wield this power that is completely disproportionate to their numbers in Britain. So, you know, if you really look at the CEOs and the politicians and the heads of banks, you know, they're all people that have gone to these very, very insular, exclusive institutions. And, you know, I think there's this kind of like Jeeves and Worcester approach to like society, and like, you know, Enid Blyton's or whatever the books I grew up on. And suddenly I was like, this isn't that funny. Like the class divide is pretty terrifying to me. And then I think when I moved to America, I did have this like very utopian vision of a classless society here. I thought like, well, they don't care about how you pronounce your vowels, and you know, posh doesn't really mean anything. Because I once tried to explain to an American friend about the notion, there's this phrase in Britain that's like, don't get above yourself, which is like the literal definition of the American dream, right? Getting above yourself is the whole goal. And they were like, that just makes no sense. So I think, you know, increasingly, and I think particularly if you're writing in any way from a place of privilege, it just became really important to me to call that stuff out and just be like, well, this is pretty messed up. And then particularly being an American, realizing, well, it doesn't manifest in the same way, but the class divide is a very real thing here. You know, like wealth discrepancy, I think, is probably about as high as it's ever been. So, and particularly like during the pandemic, I think we're seeing, you know, that split even more acutely. So yeah, class plays a big role in this book.
Well, it's also interesting to think of like this class as currency in a way, because you were talking about memory and what that means to you, and what that, but you know, all of these girls are wearing the same uniform, going to the same classes, doing the same things.
Yeah.
No one's there to tell them, you know, what class they are, or that's the dream goal, like, you know, that you're on an equal playing field. And then to go back and say like, well, my memory means more than yours, or yours means more than mine. That's really
valid.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things that I wanted to create about writing about that kind of world is, you know, the ritual and the pageantry that is created in these schools. You know, its aim is to make like the reality of that school world the only real thing in your life. You know, these girls don't read newspapers. They've got very, you know, all of these momentous like political things were happening in the 90s, like the Berlin Wall was falling down, like all of, and they just didn't care. I mean, they're so insular. And I think a lot of these people will just exist in that bubble, you know, and on and on and on. It never really, you know, that old girls network is a very powerful, and old boys network is a really powerful force, I think. So, yeah.
Maureen Roberts asked, did your school close because of a scandal, or, you know?
Well, I should say that the book is fiction. I mean, I think a bit like Vendela, like you do borrow from your memories. You know, it was a boarding school, and it ran out of money, and it started selling off bits of itself to stay alive. And then in the end, it had to merge with another school, I think. And then so the pupils went to this other school, and then eventually they just shut down the school. So yeah, I mean, in terms of scandal, there wasn't in my year in the story, the scandalous event in the book. You know, none of that actually happened. But there was, one of the things that was real was that the year above me did have a very like vengeful dares incident where they just went wild, and it coincided with a really slow summer of news. So for this very bizarre period in my teenage years, our school was sort of front page news, you know, so it was really, really odd. I think that they suspended almost all of the year, and they were, you know, it was kind of this very crazy period. There was obviously like nothing else of interest happening in the world, but that's the only bit about it that is, you know, true to the story.
Yeah. So Lily and Dabney, how'd you come up with the title? And then I'm going to add on to that, this cover is so unique. I don't know if there's anything you want to say about the cover, but
I love it so much. So the title, actually, you know, originally the book had a different name because, you know, I was worried about when it was going out in England about maybe how posh the name was, I guess, in a way. Like I was worried that it would be pigeonholed as this book just about posh girls and nothing more. Excuse me, nothing more. So it was actually my lovely agent Julia, who was just like, I think we should just call it The Divines. It's a really good name. And for a long time, the start of the novel had been, you know, I am divine, my mother was divine. So, you know, the idea, and I think I was playing a lot with the idea of Greek mythology in the book. So the idea of divinity and divines plays a larger role than just the name of the school. And then, oh, the book cover, I know, I've just been stroking it. Yeah, I mean, this is the one, like, wonderful Mumtaza William Morrow, who just guided me through this process, along with Liz, my editor. But yeah, Beth Hokel, who is the incredible collage artist, very kindly let us use the image for the book. I love it. It's sort of sinister and kind of pretty in equal measure,
I think captures this book. Well, I think Lainey's sharing the jacket a little bit. And I am curious, you know, speaking of, you know, the vicious side of things, I'm curious about like how you go back, how you write that without being like, well, you're a writer, but like you could so easily devolve into like overly, you know, just like overly vicious, but they're very complex characters. What was that like writing?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the fun things, I guess I am drawn to unlikable narrators. I mean, I know lots of people don't, but I feel like, you know, we're all quite complex as human beings. And I think particularly when navigating the teenage years, teenagers are like very mercurial, and, you know, they shape shift, and, you know, they switch allegiances very quickly. They operate a bit like packs. You know, it's a very kind of ugly stage of life, I feel like, at least an awkwardness, and, you know, there's what your body's doing, which is very strange and alien, and there's this very odd like pecking order that I think everyone feels, and that sort of dangerous like pendulum swing of popularity that you push and pull against. You know, I think like Zephine's quite complex, because I think you know, it'd be disingenuous to say that she wasn't extremely privileged. You know, she really is, but she's also tried to forge her own path, and I think she's pushed and pulled between these moments in her past that have shaped her, and trying to work out who she is as a mother, or as a wife, as a woman. And I think that's complicated. You know, I think I had a lot of fun writing the teenage meanness, because I could just felt like I could just be really indulgent with it, and kind of really pluck out those moments where you feel like the slap of what it is to be sort of rejected by a group. And you know, putting Coventry, I don't know if does that expression translate? I'm not sure. Do you know that, guys?
No, I'm sorry.
There's this really British expression called being put in Coventry, which basically means that people give you the silent treatment and no one speaks to you. And, you know, you can walk into a room and everyone will just, you know, these really, really mean things that girls do to each other when they're kind of battling.
Yeah, wielding isolation. That's and that's something in Vendela's book that happens too, and it's so true. It rings so true, and it's so painful to read, like, and very genuine.
I don't think boys do it. I mean, I might be wrong. You could probably speak to that more than I could, but I feel like that's a very particularly female weapon at that age.
Completely, yeah. And it's just rendered so tangible in the book. So congrats on that. You know, so as a first-time novelist, what was it like navigating the story as far as like plotting? Like, did you have it kind of fully formed in your head, or how did that work?
It had taken lots of different shapes. I mean, I knew that I wanted two voices, but I think the very first earlier drafts of the books were very heavy on the 90s time period, but probably thinner on the contemporary sections. And I think to have an understanding of, you know, Josephine's culpability, like, you had to have a fuller sense of her as an adult, and how these mistakes that you make when you're young then go on to change you, how they inform the relationships you have when you're older. I mean, she has some quite sneaky, secretive behaviour, and, you know, as she's an adult, and you know, hiding things from her husband, I suppose, and you know, and I think I realised, or, you know, both Julia and my editor, who's incredible, Liz, really helped me like pull out, really flesh out those bits of the book. I think at one point I had there's like a sort of Facebook message group, or a board where that comes in towards the end of the book, where people are posting their reminiscences about the school. And I had those interspersed in an earlier version through the book, but it was just a bit clunky and awkward. It was one of those things that seemed like a really cool idea, and then I did it and was like, oh, that's terrible. Pull it out.
Yeah.
Pull it out.
What's the phrase people use for that? Kill your darlings or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of that, and I think I guess what's been so fascinating about the process is, your book finds a home and it's phenomenally exciting, and then everyone warns you about the letter that will arrive from your editor, but you're never really prepared for it. I mean, I'd read Courtney Mann has this incredible book which is about a guide to getting published, so I had done my homework. I knew that something was coming, and then you take a deep breath and you're like, oh my God. I mean, it's just pages of editorial notes, which I just slammed back down. I was like, can't look at that. And then actually it just becomes this wonderful conversation, and you find the book is so much richer for having had that experience. I'm so indebted to everyone that's helped work on the book. I'm very lucky.
Excellent. Have you found, as far as reader reactions here versus the UK, are they significantly different? I mean, I think the themes are universal and approachable, but has it been different at all?
That's the really lovely thing. One thing that I was worried about was that I was like, well, I know that people, Britishness is appealing, I guess, but I was like, I just don't know whether people will share and have anything in common with this experience, because it's a very specific bit of British culture, the boarding school setting. And although some of it is set in America, it's really, the majority of it is set in 90s Britain, and I just wondered whether that would be too foreign an experience. And then what's been so great is that it's almost irrelevant where it's set. People completely share the same teenage experience. I mean, it's so universal, those feelings. And I think people have been saying, it makes me wonder what it is that I've chosen to remember, how many of my memories I've framed myself, as the heroine of my story, and now I look back and I'm like, ooh, maybe I'm not, so that's been really nice to share, to hear people share that experience, that they can see themselves as one of these girls.
Fantastic.
Really nice to know that the silent treatment for all females is universal, but that's the poisonous silent treatment.
Imagine it now to our friends.
I might have to implement that later. So our friend Jennifer Winberry said, boarding school seems as if it would be a very intimate experience, maybe even not for everybody. But how do you think that affected the relationships in the book?
I think it heightens. I think the stakes are higher, it feels like, in a boarding school. And I think for Josephine in particular, it's a difficult one because she's really torn between two worlds. She's, absolutely part of this very elite bubble whose rules and rituals have shaped her to that point. And, her whole sense of self-worth is dictated by these girls in her group, and particularly Skipper, her sort of former best friend. Yet she's also now friends with one of the local girls, this townie called Lauren, who, she finds hypnotic, I think, because Lauren is, kind of working class and proud. She comes from this very loud, forthright family, and Josephine's an only child with very reserved, stiff upper lip parents. And so I think she's pulled between the two worlds, and it's that kind of friction in the book that I think puts her in such a strange position, because she really doesn't know which world she belongs to, I think, for a lot of the story.
Excellent. And Shannon Spees says, love that becoming a mother and how it changes you and your outlook is in this book. Sounds wonderful. Between the story and the jacket, we have many excited up and coming readers who will be picking it up. And yeah, I think, again, to all the viewers, I think this has widespread appeal. I mean, I love a classic boarding school novel, frankly, again, and it's not part of my experience, but I just love the dynamics of play. And then with the larger kind of economic viewpoints, and class divides, it's fascinating. So it's like a stay up all night read. Absolutely love it. And I want to thank you for joining us, Ellie. I know, again, these are tumultuous times, but this is what I think people and our viewers needed. So we so appreciate it. But before we close, is there anything else you want to say about the
Well,
book?
I mean, I just want to say a massive thank you to librarians. Honestly, one of my local branches is available for pick up. So you order online and you pick up. And honestly, the day that I had all of my back orders arrive was just the best. I mean, it was just, I feel like the only way I'm keeping sane right now is by like ferociously reading. So yeah, thank you to everyone that's getting the word out there and getting books into people's hands. It's, yeah, couldn't be more grateful.
Oh, well, they so appreciate it. And Lainey, I think you're muted. Were you saying something? No, okay. I just wanted to make sure. Yeah, seriously. Thank you, Ellie. Again, we're for those of you watching, we'll share the links to the Divines on Edelweiss and NetGalley so you can get an advanced read. It's going on sale January 19th. So again, get your library reads votes in by December 1st. But most importantly, just give it a read because you won't put it down. So again, Ellie, thank you so much for joining us. It's been
No problem.
fantastic. All right, good luck with the rest of today.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you. All right, and just some quick housekeeping, viewers. We do want to let you know next Tuesday, we have another Facebook Live coming up with the one and only Anthony Horowitz, author of Moonflower Murders. I'll share the link to the Facebook event so you can receive reminders. So again, that is next Tuesday, November 10th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the one and only Anthony Horowitz. So definitely join us for that. Lana, do we have some Instagram news? Any events coming up?
Breaking news. So, everybody knows we've been doing these every Friday. So tomorrow, yes, it is Thursday. I forget what day it is. But tomorrow's Friday. And Alexandria Belfour, who the author of Written in the Stars, is going to take over and show us the writing space and tell us about the book. Love this book. Written in Stars, Own Voices, queer rom-com, retelling of Bridget Jones' Diary and Pride and Prejudice. And she's going to be taking over all day. So I hope you tune in to take a look. Harper Library is where you can find that. Oh, and if you want to get in the mood, we have a podcast episode with Alexandria. I interviewed her at PLA, and that is in our Harper Library Instagram bio if you want to go get ready for that.
Well, and I think that does it for us today. I want to thank everyone for joining us, learning about these fantastic books. Again, I know it's there's a lot going on, we could say, and I hope you found some just pure book enjoyment, learned some things, and hopefully found 2 fantastic reads. They should be at the top of your TBR file, I assure you. And we'll see you on Tuesday, and we're here for you. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, leave them in the comments. We'll get back to you. And
one thing I can point out is we have our voicemail that is set up and it's always available. So if you want to tell us about a book you're reading or a comfort book that you've been reading, or just how you are, it could be anything. So you can find it on librarylovefest.com, but it's 212-207-7773. So I don't know, we want to hear from you. Let us know.
Yeah, let us know how you're doing. Let us know what you're reading, whatever you want. And in the meantime, stay safe, stay sane, and we'll see you on Tuesday. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.